I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. The copper bosses shot you, Joe. They killed you, Joe, said I. Takes more than guns to kill a man, says Joe, I didn't die. Says Joe, I didn't die. My awareness of this kind of music really came about hearing recordings and songs by Woody Guthrie. The Dust Bowl ballads, farmers being dispossessed from their land because their crops were just completely dusted over. There was nowhere to go. They went to California, and as Woody said, California's a Garden of Eden, but you won't find it so hot if you ain't got that do-re-mi. So they found a way to protest even when they were in the Garden of Eden.
This land is your land, and this land is my land, from the California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me.
Now, Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land is actually a protest song. It's weird to think of it that way because, you know, when you're a kid in America, you grow up singing that song in like kindergarten, you know? So you can learn about the geography of the United States, right? But Woody Guthrie wrote it as a protest song in reaction to God Bless America, a kind of song that would really piss the guys in Rage Against the Machine off because, well, it mentions God and it mentions America, two things they'd like to do away with, right? But Woody Guthrie writes this song in order to say, you know, this land belongs to you. This is yours. Doesn't belong to anybody else. Doesn't belong to God, doesn't belong to people in Washington, doesn't belong to anyone at any corporation or anywhere. It's your land. You go wherever you want, you do whatever you want. This land was made for you and me. It's a universal song.
So the Dust Bowl ballads of Woody Guthrie are monumental protest songs, although the concept or the term protest really hadn't existed or hadn't been born yet. It was just the way people began to express themselves. People who had something to say and chose to say it in music and in poetry, or setting poems to familiar tunes, and it just grew from there.
Woody Guthrie was a really central figure. He was very much a part of that labor movement. He was very close to the entire left, including the Communist Party, and he really was the first major voice to catalyze the union movement songs to a wider audience. And very much in concert with his friend Pete Segar and others, the Almanac Singers, they become a real bridge between the labor movement and later movements like the Civil Rights Movement.
As Rage Against the Machine would later endeavour to do, both Woody Guthrie and Pete Segar sought to bring their message to a wider audience, utilising the power of song.
Well, there's nothing like getting people singing together, either just to have a good time or to argue about something. There's this great impulse to express yourself in song. And a simple rhyme, repeated over and over again, a catchy tune, very often a tune that people knew from another context, fitted with new sets of words.
I have a hammer, I hammer in the morning, I hammer in the evening, all over the land. I hammer freedom, I hammer out freedom,
It was Pete Segar, though, I think, who realized very early on that getting masses of people to sing together was a very, very vital way to get a message across. Not that everybody had to know all the words, but if they could be taught the catch line of the chorus, somehow to join in. And all of a sudden, slowly, people began to hear this new kind, what they thought was new kind of music.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome.
think it's important when talking about protest music to talk about two different kinds. One is the kind actually produced in the movement. And a good example of that is the African American Civil Rights Movement. Their old songs from the gospel tradition, from what they're called freedom songs, were adapted and actually used in the movement, used in demonstrations, used in the churches where they organized and kind of prepared themselves, used in the jails when they were arrested for civil disobedience. It was very much woven into the everyday life of the activists. And then you have a kind of more distant but equally important kind of protest movement that is from artists who are associated with or supportive of. Bob Dylan is a classic example of this. He became marginally involved in the civil rights movement in groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but he was not a heavy activist. But his songs became very important in spreading the word about the movement to a wider audience, particularly of young, white, middle, and working class kids. And so he provided a kind of link to the larger movement.
How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? Yes, and how many seas must the white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand?
A group like Rage Against the Machine is kind of in between. They, of course, were the soundtrack for a number of demonstrations, which were really important. They also were very much a link to the wider protest movement. They brought in people who first hear the music and then hear the lyrics. There's a wonderful comment from a rock and roller who said basically you hear the music and you forget what you're singing it before you know what you're singing. And that is a very seductive way of involving yourself in the movement. You hear something, it draws you in, and then suddenly you realize there's content there that you need to pay attention to. And I think the unusual thing about Rage was that they became very popular. They were, for a political band, they were amazingly popular, and that meant that their message was getting out to a wide audience.
Dylan's involvement and association with the protest movement in the 1960s brought the message of peace through the use of song to a larger audience and united people over contemporary issues. However, the onset of the Vietnam War was to push protest music further into the mainstream, with an array of other artists utilizing the medium to speak out against the government.
Each war produced its own protest movement, World War I, World War II. Most dramatically, of course, the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War coincided with the rise of rock and roll as a major aesthetic form. And so much of the protest movement of the 60s had a soundtrack of rock and roll. That played, again, drew upon earlier traditions, but added something new to it. And again, it was a combination of both the new and the old in very powerful ways.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear.
There was not really an outpouring of songs like that until the Vietnam War came along. And it wasn't only Pete. It was Tom Paxton. It was Phil Oakes. It was Bob Dylan.
What you have happening is an expansion of the music industry and music as an industry at this very same time that anti-war protest is growing. They in effect fed each other. So you have movement music becoming virtually indistinguishable from mainstream music in a way that hasn't been true since. You have a very vast audience. You have events like Woodstock where the entire festival has an anti-war component to it. So it was a strange way in which rock and roll became identified almost as protest music, even when the actual number of protest songs was a relatively small proportion.
Rock and roll inherited the mantle of popular protest music from the traditional folk scene, which, although no longer as prevalent, would always remain as an outlet for political opposition. The Vietnam War proved to be a peak within the protest movement in both quantity and popularity of music protesting a cause. As the 1970s dawned, artists such as John Lennon with songs like Give Peace a Chance and Imagine continued to offer a simple and widely spread message in mainstream music. However, by this time, protested music began to dissolve into more specialized areas, with no one style or genre encapsulating the sentiment. Towards the end of the decade, protested music appeared in rock and roll, reggae, folk, and also on the emerging punk scene, with artists such as The Clash tackling political issues and providing a voice for a generation. Yet as a movement, protest in song had faded from the public consciousness. Another branch that grew from the initial protest scene in the United States came about during the 1980s in hip-hop and rap, as well as hardcore punk. This in turn went on to influence both Zach De La Rocha and Tom Morello, paving the way for Rage Against the Machine's eventual sound, style, and approach.
Two main spirits of protest in Rage Against the Machine are Tom Morello and Zach De La Rocha. They bring different influences to the table. Zach was a hardcore kid. He was influenced by hardcore punk, indie rock, bands like Minor Threat, artists who in the 1980s were making loud political noises on an underground stage. Tom has that genius hard rock guitar influence. Also, he's very influenced by hip-hop, but he's also influenced by folk music. His more recent solo music has been of a kind of a Woody Guthrie bent. So here you have all the pieces in place. You have hip-hop, artists like Public Enemy. I would say Los Angeles artists like NWA are also influential on Rage Against the Machine. You have hardcore punk, and you have a little bit of that classic folky protest underneath it all, keeping it earnest.
Public Enemy's influence on Zach in particular was to create a significant part of Rage Against the Machine's agenda, both sonically and in subject matter.
I think a band like Public Enemy was a huge influence on Rage Against the Machine because, you know, and I'd say even more so on Zach than, say, Tom, because you listen to those early Public Enemy records, you know, they're pretty spare, but it's, you know, Chuck D is right there, you know, his vocals are, you know, pressed forward, and, you know, it sounds very aggressive, it sounds hectic, you know, you listen to, like, Fight the Power or something like that, it's like, there's an urgency there that's immediate.
Here's the interesting thing about Public Enemy at the tail end of the 80s. They absolutely change what you can accomplish. Musically, certainly. I mean, this is denser music than anyone has ever made before. They are the rap group that most understands the power of the electric guitar, certainly Run DMC as well. But right in that moment at the tail end of the 80s, there is Public Enemy, like, doing weird stuff with drums and guitars and totally changing the idea of how the guitar can function inside of music.
The woman makes the men all pause, and if you got a woman, she might make you forget yours. There's a 5-letter word to describe her character.
The other thing Public Enemy does is they radically change the notion of what you can and should talk about in hip-hop. It will be radically changed back very shortly by Dr. Dre, by Snoop Dogg, by Tupac. But for a brief moment, from 1988 to about 1992, Public Enemy forced everyone in hip-hop to think politically.
Before Public Enemy, there really wasn't this central voice of consciousness in rap. There were great rap singles, like The Message, that represented urban life, but a lot of early rap was about boasting, expressing yourself, talking about your neighborhood, spinning tall tales. Here comes Public Enemy with a message, with a purpose to raise the consciousness of African American people and of America in general. Chuck D of Public Enemy has famously called their music the Black People's CNN. It was supposed to tell you about the issues of the day, and the producers of Public Enemy used a sound that sounded like the city falling apart. It sounded like sirens and cops running at you and windows being broken. So the combination of that powerful, chaotic sound and Chuck D's kind of preacherly voice, Jesse Jackson-style voice, really showed a new path for political music that I think Rage has really picked up on.
Following in the footsteps of the forefathers of protest music, Zach, Tom, Tim and Brad utilized the state of the nation and the anger of the people to create their explosive debut on the music scene. A demo of 12 tracks that soon picked up strong interest from several major labels.